So here we go. So I'm so excited to have Ron Yoshida visit us in the JAJAJA community tonight for our PechaKucha series. A little bit about Ron Yoshida. He is a sansei, which is third generation Japanese American, born in 1948 in Los Angeles, California. After graduating from University of Southern California with his doctorate in educational psychology in 1974, he worked in the U.S. Department of Education, Fordham University, Queens College, CUNY, and he came to Lehigh, from which he retired in 2013. He spent 15 months between 2014 to 2015 in Doha, Qatar, advising the Qatar Foundation. He completed Ohenryo, Kobo Daishi's 88-temple, 800-mile pilgrimage in the spring of 2019, after which he visited Yanai, Yamaguchi-ken, where his maternal grandparents lived there before they immigrated to the US before 1915. So we'll hear more about that and more of his story. He has a lifelong question of where is my place between these two cultures of Japan and the US. So tonight we're so fortunate to have a local legend, Ron Yoshida, tell his story. So Ron, take it away.
Yeah, I don't know about being a local legend, but no, thank you very much. And this talk is not rehearsed. I don't have a script other than what we have up on the screen. And so, you know, it's going to free flow the way it's going to go. And if you have any questions along the way, please ask them. And I thought about the title, Melding Identities, and I can only give you my perspective. I don't know your perspective, and so we can talk about that. But it is something, and maybe struggle is too negative a word, but I guess it's trying to figure out where does one fit into, well, at least for me, in American society. And my mother always told me this, and I didn't say this to Mickey ahead of time. My mother, she and I always had disagreements, but in some respects had great wisdom. And she said, as much as you want to be someone else at times, and, you know, we kind of jokingly talk about bananas, you know, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. She said, when you look in the mirror and when people look at you, they'll know who you are. And no matter how you try to change that is how people are going to look at you initially, and who knows, even beyond that, maybe you can overcome it. And so I've thought about it, and I'm giving you my experiences as someone who was born in 1948, but who grew up after World War II, immediately afterwards, and all the way up until the present time. And so I'm giving you a perspective from the place where I was born and within the time I was born. And so people born later may have a totally different view, but or even earlier. But this is, I guess, as Mickey asked me to give my own life story. Not even my wife Sharon has heard the whole story. So, and I'm not even going to in 20 minutes give it to you. But you know, we'll go from there, and you know, whatever questions you want to ask, I'm very open to answering them. So, Mickey, next slide, please. Yeah, I took this quote. Sharon and I have been watching this series called Call the Midwife on Netflix, which I think is probably the best series that we've seen, because they confront a lot of contemporary issues, especially from the perspective of women and men, but mostly women. But also, I think what the show really shows is such a deep sense of kindness. And so in this 2020 year, if you're looking for a touch of kindness, I'd certainly recommend, if you haven't seen it, any of the episodes from The Midwife. And in one of the series, they came up with this quote, and I thought it was so apropos. A friend of mine wanted me to give a greeting to her newborn nephew. And I thought, gee, what can I say that would be different than just saying, hey, welcome into the world or congratulations or something. So I went and found this particular quote, and I'll read it. Birth is the shortest journey we will ever make. It begins in darkness, I guess they meant in utero, and ends, we think, in light. But welcomed and safe, we rest upon the shore for what amounts to moments before we begin the greatest voyage of them all. There is no map, no route, no arrowhead to follow, for none of us have ever walked this way before. And so each of us have our own journey, and you know, there's no map ahead. I think there could be some good guidance that might be there, you know, your parents and your family, friends, and so on, but there really is no map. A few years ago, I wanted to recruit graduates of my high school, which was a Jesuit high school in Los Angeles, to come to Lehigh, and actually got pretty successful at it. I don't know if any of those young people are coming to Lehigh now, but I told them that when I was sitting in your seat, if someone told me that one day I would be sitting in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I would have just said, where's Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, let alone being there. So who knows how your journey's going to go. And so, you know, we've made the journey at least to 72 years. And at this point, and if you can get to the next slide, Mickey, I would say I went through a boyhood just like many American kids. If you look at the photo on the left, I was much closer to my maternal side of the family. And so the younger woman in the picture is my mother in 1954. And the three boys that are, if you look at the photo to the right, I'm the shortest. I've always been the shortest in any group I've been. Those are the three cousins that I really am the closest to, and they'll be in another photograph that you'll see. And that's their grandparents standing in the background. The woman is my grandmother's first cousin, and they were the ones who came over from Japan back in the early 1900s. And this was a boat, and I can still remember that trip when we boarded it to go from Catalina Island off of California and back to Long Beach after we went on that trip. And you could see the American flag in the background. So here we are, Americans, all born, my mother and three cousins and I, in the United States, and we were natural born citizens of the United States, whereas the two older people in the background were not citizens, and until 1952, by law, they couldn't become citizens of the United States. So that's all part of the background that weighs in my head a bit too. And here I grow up, and in 1966, there's my high school graduation photograph, and with two buds that the fellow in the center has been my best friend since 1966, or really earlier. I guess it would be like 1962 when we first met. And turns out I'm the godfather to his daughter. What a pistol, trying to, yes, keep her on the right path. Yeah, sure. But he and I have known each other for way over 50 years. And we have gone through some very interesting times together, and some of them that also dealt with being Japanese. But I'll leave that, and if we get to that story, I'll talk about it. But what I really wanted to project was that life was good, here, didn't really want for anything, had love in the family, never wanted for food, got exposed to many different things. My parents sent me to, a college prep high school, and that served me well as I went into college. So one could look at this as the all-American family and, moving along and being successful in life. Next slide, please. This is my 50th high school reunion, which was, let's see, that would have been 4 years ago. And if you look at the photograph, when I scanned it in, I for some reason I kept it on the black and white, but the photograph is in color. But I want you to just look at the photograph very carefully for a moment and just scan the faces. And I think one thing that I can definitely say from this, and that I'm the only person who looks different in that photograph. Well, not quite the only one. The fellow in the very back with the sunglasses is another very good friend of mine, and he was Mexican-American, and there are a few other Mexicans in that group, but I was the only Asian. And there were, I think, 2 other fellows in my class who were Asian in that class. So as I grew up, I didn't grow up around Japanese people, though in LA, we went to Little Tokyo once a week and did our shopping there, and went to the barber shop and had sushi or sashimi, and also there was a wonderful Chinese restaurant called the Far East Cafe that is actually an historical landmark in Los Angeles now on East First Street. And my parents were married in that area at the Honganji that was there. And across from that is the Japanese American National Museum as it exists today. But I was just, pointing out in this photograph that those are the fellows I grew up with in high school. And again, in my growing up, I was one of the very few Asian people in that class. Next photo. And so, here's a photograph that I forget who took it. Maybe it was my sister. But this was the last time that all of this part of the family got together. And the 3 boys that were in the photograph with me in 1954 are the 3 tallest in the background there. They're 3 brothers. And the one in the center, the young lady in front, Emmy, graduated from Lehigh in 2001. And she became a parent, I guess 2 years ago or a year ago. As someone said, a geriatric pregnancy, because she was, older than 35. And so I guess if you do that, you get into a high risk situation. But she graduated from Lehigh in 2001. I was provost at the time. And seated in the front are my mother and father on the ends, and the woman in the center is her cousin, and the mother of the 3 fellows that are in the photograph. You'll see Sharon next to 2 of them. And but if you look at the family and you say, boy, we're in the United States of America. So, in today's, I'm thinking about my family, both on the Yoshida side and on this Kuniyuki side, that very few of us have married Japanese women or men. And it's become a very diverse family. And it's certainly quite different than the life that my grandparents and my mother and father went through back in the early 20th century and into World War II. But so, if, I'll just stop there for a moment and just say life has been very good. I've traveled to 73 countries. I married a very good woman that, we've been married 36 years. We live a comfortable life. In my own professional career, I would say the achievement I feel most proud of is graduating 39 doctoral students who have gone on to do other good things. And so I have nothing to complain about in terms of my life. I did tell Mickey I did have 2 regrets, and this may segue into where we're headed in identity. One is I wish that I had learned Japanese. My mother and father sent me to Saturday Japanese Nihon Gakuen. And I didn't really like it that much because, all my friends were, out playing baseball and having a good time or whatever they were doing. And here I had to go to Japanese school. And, after 5 days of school to go to the 6th day. And so after 3 years of that, I think my parents figured out that wasn't the right course for me. I actually was an F student, truth be told. And I think they finally figured out it was a waste of time and money to have me do that, though it is a regret in my life because I wish I had listened to my mom and dad and learned Japanese. They could speak Japanese. They were born in the United States, but you know, we grew up in this very Japanese family, and so they were fluent speakers, and that's one thing. And the other regret I have, and I've tried to encourage younger people to not be as afraid as I was, but you know, if you took yourself back to 1968 when I was a junior at Southern Cal, I had an opportunity to spend a year at Waseda University in Tokyo under a third year, you know, junior in foreign lands program, and I didn't do it. You know, back then, you know, there was no internet, there was no easy calling home. I still remember that to call home, and if you think in terms of $1968, it was $3 for 3 minutes. And so, you know, who had that money to call? And so you were basically on your own. Once you got on the plane and landed in Japan, you were there, and you were going to be there for 9 months. And in the end, I made up other excuses, but I look back and I say, geez, you know, what life could have been like had I decided to have learned the Japanese language and to have gone to Waseda University. So in all of what has been a very good life, I think those are the two regrets that I have. And part of that struggle in terms of the identity, I didn't end up going to Japan until I was 55. And Sharon actually got to Japan before I did. Just after 9/11, she went to Kyoto University to take courses in gardening, and enjoyed Kyoto so much. And so it wasn't until 2005 that I first went to Japan, and we went to Kyoto and spent almost 2 weeks just in Kyoto, with one quick visit to Osaka to see Bunraku, and so it took a while for me to become comfortable in it. You know, you look Japanese, but you can't speak Japanese, and the awkwardness of that. At least I felt it was awkward, and so it prevented me from going. And but once I went, and if we could get to the next slide, you know, I had let me just say, you know, the quote that I gave about, you know, you're born and then you're on to your own life, and who knows what that map may be. I think the quote was somewhat inadequate, because we all bring a past to our lives, and that past is a Japanese part of my life, and it's the family I was born into with its history. For example, I lived with my maternal grandmother and grandparents. I mean, literally lived with them in their same bedroom until I was 12 years old. And also, about that same time, I didn't know anything about Japanese internment. And I was rummaging through my parents' closet, and I came upon a photograph album that revealed that this had happened. Now imagine in 1960 having no clue about this, and then going to my parents and asking about it. So I don't mean to put it on the same level of the Holocaust, but I know friends of mine who are children of Holocaust survivors that no one talks about these things. And so about the internment, nothing was ever talked about. And even though we, you know, and you could get to the next slide, you know, it's just the discovery of these things. And eventually, I think the culmination of that was when I went on Ohenro. And I never really knew about Ohenro until Sharon and I were in Japan in 2018, and we went up to Koyasan. And on the way down from Koyasan, we met this young man, and he talked about the Ohenro, and he was a policeman from Australia. He was around 40, 41 years old. And he said that doing Ohenro renewed his faith in mankind. And so I said, boy, that's a pretty powerful thing. So I did research on it. But even at that moment, I turned to Sharon and I said, 1 year from now, I'm going to do Ohenro. And certainly 1 year, a little bit more, because it was better to go in spring than the fall. I went on Ohenro, and you could see photographs of it. The one on the left was what I wore when I walked around, and visiting that was temple number 3 of 88 temples. And then this woman in the center reminded me so much of my grandmother, and notice how much taller I am. I was always the shortest in everything, and here I tower over this woman as I did my grandmother. Her name's Michan, and she had a minchiku that was very famous in Japan because it was written about in Asahi Shimbun. And here she is. She supported her family, and she's in her late 70s, and yet she's hosting Ohenro visitors in her town. And this was between, I think, Temple 34 and 35 on the way. And the gentleman on the right, I was lucky enough that I met him in Ofuro in one of the minchikus after walking Temple 20 and 21. That was 2 peaks. You start at the bottom, you go up 3,000 feet, come down to the riverbed, and you go up another 3,000 feet, and you come back down. And then you do another climb to 1,000 feet. And then finally you reached, Temple 20, I think it was Temple 22. And at that place was this minchiku. And so we were having ofuro, and I forget what he said. There's a word where it's like, this is heaven. And from that point, we walked together for the next 23 days. And here we were in Matsuyama when he had to leave. And so I'm still in touch with him, but there was an interesting moment when, you would see other people doing Ohenro and you'd wave, and then it turned out we were at this minchiku with these other folks, and we sat down to have dinner, and they started to ask me questions, which I could understand. And as soon as I answered, there's this silence, this look. And I said, I wonder what's going on. And then they launch into this very high level Japanese. And so Aoyama-san told me later that they thought I was really Nihonjin until I spoke. We had to launch into this long explanation that I was Nikkei sansei and I had come from America, but my, Oji-san, Oba-san, and, we're Nihonjin and so on. And I think at that moment, it really revealed to me that I'm not Japanese, like, duh, and I could never be Japanese, that I'm really an American, but, have this very deep-seated feeling about Japan because it comes from the past. It comes from, my grandmother and my grandfather, my mother and my father. And it's something that, again, how do you balance that deep feeling of being Japanese, but, having grown up in this culture. But if you're interested in my blog, I wrote every day on the Ohenro, and there's the link that you can go to and read, 48 days of Ohenro and a beginning and an epilogue that I wrote about. Next slide, please. And so I do have photographs. I'm known as the historian of the family, and these are my grandparents. The fellow who is the fish is my paternal grandfather, and he's the fellow that's, if you're looking at the photo on the right-hand side, those photos were taken around 1910 in the United States. And this part of the family came from Kurume, which is part of Fukuoka. And I was telling Mickey that from the Kosekis, a first cousin was able to trace our family back to 1154. And we were part of the Fujiwara clan. So, and that was a very powerful clan in medieval Japan. And I wasn't as close to my father's side of the family, but I got to know all of my grandparents. This fellow died when I was 7. His wife, my grandmother, died when I was 21. So I had an opportunity to see them. So let's see my mother's side of the family, which I was much closer to. The woman on the left is my great-grandmother. It's the only photograph I have of her. She never came to the United States. Her name was Yone Kuniyuki. And the photo on the right is my great-grandfather. He's the one sitting down, I guess, with a watch chain across his chest. And the fellow to his right in the back is my grandfather, who was the firstborn son, which really surprised me that he came to the United States, because the other fellow on the left, his brother, is the youngest. He was the 7th of 7 children, as my grandmother was the 4th daughter of 7 children. And as I understood, and I forgot to mention that my grandfather on my father's side was the 7th child, the last son of 7. I don't know, everyone seemed to have 7 kids in Japan, but it surprised me, and there's no one that I can go to ask the question, why did my grandfather come to the United States as the firstborn son? There was another brother that came in who died in 1938, but he's not pictured in the photograph. The woman that's in that photograph is my grandmother, who came in 1915, whose koseki I was able to trace back to 1825 in Yanai. And I was told that if I wanted to go even further back, I'd have to go to Kobe to get that. And trying to get the kosekis in Japan is not an easy thing. And the young girl there is my mother, and that photograph was taken in 1925. But, you know, what's fascinating to me is you see Yone on the left in kimono, and then you see, you know, on the right already as first generation immigrants, you know, dressing very Western and you know, looking like anybody in a more formal sense would be looking like in the United States. Next, please. So I grew up a lot in the Japanese culture. We celebrated Shogatsu every year, and there's my grandmother. And I looked at the date on this photograph, one of the few that were dated, and that goes back to 1941. So that's January 1, 1941, before, you know, Pearl Harbor and the, you know, what happened on December 8th. And then to the right is my grandmother's Tanjobi at 88 years old, you know, and we celebrated my grandfather's 88th, and we celebrated my father's 88th and my mother's 88th, you know, in the tradition of you know, 88 being such a good luck year. But, and I don't know if you can see on the cake, there's kanji written, and, you know, this was at our home that my sister now lives in. But, you know, as I mentioned, I actually grew up in the bedroom with my grandmother and grandfather. And so when you think about closeness to Japanese culture, I think that's getting as pretty close as you can get over one's growing up period. Next, please. I think one thing that after I discovered the photograph album, and it was my father's photograph album, so that he was interned in Topaz, Utah. My mother and father were not married at the time. Had a profound effect on me, and it still has today, because any time that I see any kind of abridgment of civil rights in the country, it just drives me nuts. And there's a wonderful exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery. I think most people know that there's a Hall of Presidents where they have portraits of presidents, and there was a famous one of President Obama, but I was able to take a photograph. I didn't put it into this, but juxtaposed to that was a man named, I think it was Yasui, or who challenged the curfew that Japanese were under in World War II, and he was imprisoned, and that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States government that they were able to put Japanese, whether you were a citizen or not, under curfew on the West Coast. And it also was a precursor to the other court case, Korematsu versus the United States. But the photograph on the left is Topaz back in 1942, and that's where my father and his parents and his sister got married in the camp and had a child in the camp. And that's what existed between 1942 and 1945. And then Sharon and I went to visit the Topaz site. At least we've been there twice, once 15 years ago, and then this was just 2 years ago. And that's what's left. And, my father, who never really wanted to talk about this, got more and more militant about it years later. And he talked about, people saying, well, the Japanese must have had a good time in camp. And he said, well, no one lived at this place before we got there, and no one's living there now. And if you look at it, it is one of the most desolate and uninhabitable places. That's all salt flats that are in central Utah. Next. And this is where my mother and her family was, in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And I was saying to Mickey, if anyone there can read the kanji, I would appreciate it, because I have never really had a chance to ask anybody to translate it. But my grandmother and grandfather were part of the kitchen crew. People didn't cook by themselves. They had to go to a mess hall to have food. And luckily at Heart Mountain, they were able to farm. And so they were able to have fresh vegetables and had a lot more of Japanese food there than they did in Utah. You couldn't grow anything in Utah, but they did in Wyoming. And if you see the mountain in the background down the road, and then you look at the photograph that I took, you'll see that that's Heart Mountain. And the site has a museum there, and they do have an extant barrack from, one of those those houses or whatever it is on the left-hand side on the Heart Mountain site. But Heart Mountain was such a good farming country that it reverted back to being farms back after the war. It was auctioned off, and so now when you go there, they're crops. Next slide. So I wanted to just, in a quick way, just say, hey, I'm not a person who has sour grapes or anything like that. I've lived a very good life. But it's been a bit more complex. It's not, just a straight line, or it wasn't from one's own emotion, totally resolved. It was, who am I in the sense of looking different, coming from a different family. I remember one time when I was in elementary school, someone asked me if I understood diversity, and I said, look, when I was in first grade, my best friend was Mexican. He's still a very good friend, lives in Santa Barbara. He became a battalion chief of the Santa Barbara County Fire Department, and he was Mexican, and we would trade sushi for tamales. Now think about that. In 1954, we're on the playground. Hey, I have some of this stuff, this rice stuff. Hey, you've got tamales. Let's trade. So I grew up in a very unusual way, not around a lot of Japanese, a lot of diversity and so forth. But it's still like, who am I? So I put out these Venn diagrams. And I haven't resolved which Venn diagram best fits. And maybe it's a mixture of the two. In the one on the left, of course, the intersection is the light blue. And you maintain separate identities, but then you have this intersection. I don't think that quite explains where my head is on this. The one on the right is that B is a proper subset of A. So I can be B, Japanese, but I exist within being A, an American. So maybe that's a better fit, but it's something that I've struggled with, and Ohenro actually helped kind of resolve this. And it's not that I'm totally comfortable, but that's where I am. And I don't know if you feel that same way, or maybe not the same way, but in a similar way, or have struggles thinking about this. whether or not your children have any of these issues. But, you know, again, I think Mickey just wanted me to put out the story and say, hey, here's someone's story, and this is how he is 72 years later. So I'll end there and take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Ron.